In the next three lectures, we're going to spend some time looking at the victims in the criminal justice system. We've talked almost exclusively about defendants and eyewitness testimony and things like that, jurors who have to make decisions, attorneys, but now we're going to turn our attention to the victims of crimes and their roles in the in the criminal court system. First of all, what are the rights of the victim? Actually, until recently, victims didn't really have a whole lot of rights in our system. In fact, they're often a powerless participant in the system. For example, it wasn't until recently that victims were even informed or were supposed to be informed about case developments. For example, if a case was going to be dropped, the victim might not even be notified. And it's kind of interesting that the victim is so powerless in the criminal justice system because they're very important. They play a very important role in the court system. I mean, they play a role as an eyewitness, they play a role as a witness in court, and so forth and so on. And so it's kind of stunning that they have so little place in the system. But it's not really that surprising when you really think about it, because remember, in a criminal case, the crime is not against the victim. The crime is against the state. And so the victim of the crime is the state of Wyoming, if the crime was committed in Wyoming. And so even though an individual was hurt or harmed or robbed or stabbed, they aren't actually the victim per se. And so it's not surprising then, given that sort of state framework, that victims often have expressed dissatisfaction with their treatment in the system. Now, it wasn't always this way. Prior to the American Revolution, the victim was a central part of any criminal case. In fact, it was the victim that often was asked to determine the fate of the offender. So the victim actually could speak out and speak about what they thought the fate of the offender should be. And compensation was the norm back then. And in fact, at that time, the victim was supposed to be repaid at 3 times the value of what was taken from them. So as you can see, the victim not only had an important part in the criminal case, they were expected to be repaid in some way. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, I mean, given our Constitution and our Bill of Rights, it shifted that role from the victim to the state, and the rights of the victim declined over the next 200 years. Fast forward, very fast forward, to more recent developments. And when I say recent, I'm talking about in the 90s. In the 1990s and beyond, victims' rights have become more important. You saw this happening in the beginning of the 90s, but there have been developments since then that have tried to include the victim more and more in a thoughtful way in criminal cases. And in fact, what you saw legislators and court systems become more concerned about how the laws responded to victims and to develop new laws that would respond to victims. Let me just give you a perfect example of our own state. In 1991, the state legislature passed the Wyoming's Crime Victim Bill of Rights. And there are these rights now that are statutorily defined, that were statutorily defined by the legislature. I'm just going to quickly pull through these. And you can see, for example, the first one, to be treated with compassion and respect. That seems quite obvious. The right to know where the offender is and the current status of the case. Restitution, the right to know your rights, okay? Again, another place, victim compensation, that you deserve reasonable protection and safety. So for example, if we let the defendant go or he's out on bail, we need to make sure that you're safe. The right to the prompt return of property. Somebody stole something from you, you should be able to get it back in a reasonable amount of time. The right to preserve employment. So if you're an eyewitness and you have to attend hearings and so forth. You shouldn't lose your job. The right to be informed about the opportunity to make a victim impact statement. And this is something that we're going to spend a little bit more time talking about. But this is fairly new as well. The ability to talk in court about how the crime impacted you. And finally, the right to be present at trial. So let's spend a little bit more time talking about these two pieces. This idea that somebody took something away from you and you should be compensated. And then we're also going to spend some time talking about victim impact statements and the right to be present at trial. But we're going to do that in a later lecture. Let's talk a little bit more about compensation and restitution. Restitution is an old concept. What you have to do is you as the defendant or the criminal, you took something from the victim that had a certain value, $100. And you have to give up what you got to the victim. So if you stole $100 from the victim, you need to give $100 back. But restitution might also ask you to give back more than you took. Because what you're trying to do is not only give back the gains to the victim, but you need to restore the victim to where they were before. And that may take a little bit more. So for example, if I stole $100 from you, but I hit you at the same time and you required stitches that cost $500, now I need to return to you $600 to put you in the balance to where you were. Okay? Compensation is a related term. Compensation is, again, to repay what you took. But it may not exceed what you took. So there's not an additional piece. You repay what you took. And we have compensation more in the present day than restitution. And we have that in the form of crime compensation boards. Often states have these boards established, and when somebody's committed a crime, they may have to put some money into crime compensation boards. In fact, 3/4 of the states have compensation boards. So there is money there, and then if you're a victim of a crime, you can ask for some compensation, especially if you had some medical costs associated with your victimization, things like that. Defendants are asked to put money into these funds. Sadly, however, as you might guess, most of these compensation boards are very, very underfunded. There is no way that they have enough money to compensate victims for what they lost. But at least it shows you that the states are trying to do something to at least address the needs of victims. Finally, I alluded to this already before when I talked about victim impact statements. The ability of victims to be able to participate in the crime proceedings. And one of the most important cases in this regard is Payne versus Tennessee. This was a case in which Payne, he murdered a 28-year-old woman named Sharice Christopher and her 2-year-old daughter. Her 3-year-old son was also injured during this episode, but he lived. They lived together in an apartment of 3. And Payne was visiting his girlfriend next door, and she wasn't home. And he spent the day drinking and doing cocaine, and then he broke into Sharice's apartment and tried to sexually assault her. And she resisted, and he murdered her and stabbed her. He came with a knife and stabbed her many times. There was blood all over the place. There was screaming. This was not a whodunit. At sentencing, now, as I told you, Nicholas survived, her 3-year-old son. At sentencing, Sharice's mother gave a statement of the impact. She described to the court how Nicholas cries for his mom. She says she said he doesn't seem to understand why she doesn't come home, and he cries for sister Lacey. He comes to me many times during the week and asks me, "Grandmama, do you miss Lacey?" And I tell him yes. He says, "I'm worried about my Lacey." So this mother gave, this grandmother of Nicholas gave a victim impact statement at court. And of course, this case was appealed. And the whole point of this appeal was that the victim impact statement was unfair and led to a death penalty sentence for Payne. The Supreme Court, however, upheld the death penalty and paved the way for victims to be able to speak in court about the impact that the crime has had on them. So victim impact statements, the Payne versus Tennessee case, is a very, very pivotal case in allowing victim impact statements to be heard in court. Another participation is the right to attend execution. And this particular one, this was an Oklahoma legislator who won the rights for families of victims to attend the execution of the defendant. He himself, he and his sister were witnesses to an attack on his parents when he was a child that left them both dead. And the attacker in this particular case was found guilty, and was sentenced to death. And when this legislator grew up, the defendant finally was going to be executed, and he fought for the right for families to actually be at the execution. So now Oklahoma does allow families to attend, and since 1996, Texas, Virginia, Louisiana, California, Washington, and Illinois also allow participants, families, to watch the execution of a murderer. Okay, so you can see that the victim has become more important from the early 90s to right now. And in fact, if you look at some of our decisions, we're not only protecting victims, current victims, but we're protecting future victims. If you think about it, sexual offender registries are not in place to protect past victims, but rather they're there to notify and protect future victims. So you can see that, I mean, a sexual offender has served his time, and I say his because most of the time it is a him, although there are female offenders as well. But they've served their time, and why then are we notifying people about their presence? Well, the reason why is because we know that sexual offenders tend to have higher rates of recidivism than others. And so the importance then is we think it's important to protect victims in the future. So let's just take a quick look at Wyoming's registry so you just get a sense or an idea of what these registries look like. So here's the Wyoming registry. You have to agree to the terms and conditions. I'm not a robot. And so I will search for offenders in my area. I can type in Laramie, and here comes out all the offenders that are in the Laramie area. Okay, when you click on the offenders, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but I just want to show you. Here is an individual. It tells you what their offense was. This was a sexual abuse of a minor, first-degree sexual offense. And here you see the actor was greater than or equal to 18, that there, and the victim was less than 18. Okay, you can have, it has all the vehicles that this individual has been known to drive, other known addresses, and all kinds of information about these potential offenders or these past offenders. And what is the purpose of this? It is not to protect those who have been victimized by them in the past, but rather to protect potentially future victims. Okay, so I think you can see that just in this very short lecture, there have been some significant changes in the way that we view victims in the criminal justice system. And these changes have come about in the last 25, 30 years and are a significant shift in the way we do things in this country. Next time we're going to talk more about victim impact statements, and I'll share with you some of the research that has been done in my lab looking at how victim impact statements might affect jurors' decisions. Thank you.